My name is Harold Mills. I am 73 years old, and for more than a decade now I have lived alone on this farm, tucked between the pines and the creeks that cut through the northern reaches of Oregon. It wasn't always this way. There was a time when this house held voices, laughter, the smell of Lillian's coffee in the morning and her humming while she folded laundry by the window. But that time ended the day she collapsed in the garden, her hand still holding a tomato she'd been checking for ripeness. The stroke took her before the ambulance even arrived. And when they lowered her into the ground, something in me stayed there with her. My children wanted me to move back to Portland. They insisted, really, said the farm was too much for a man my age, that I needed people around, that the isolation wasn't healthy. But I couldn't do it. The city felt like drowning. The noise, the lights, the endless parade of strangers pretending they knew what mattered. Out here, there's only the sound of wind moving through the trees, the creak of the barn when the temperature drops at night, the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. It's enough, more than enough. It's all I have left of the life I understood. My mornings follow the same pattern, and I suppose there's comfort in that. I wake before dawn, when the sky is still that deep bruise of purple and the stars haven't quite given up yet. I make coffee, black and bitter the way I've always liked it. The bread is usually a few days old by the time I get to it, but I don't mind. I toast it over the stove, scrape a little butter across the surface, and eat it standing by the window, looking out at the tree line. The radio crackles to life on the counter, tuned to the same AM station it's been tuned to for 30 years. The voices talk about politics, weather, traffic in cities I'll never visit again. I don't really listen anymore. It's just the sound of the world continuing without me, and that's all right. After breakfast, I work. There's always something that needs doing. I split wood for the stove, check the fence posts along the property line, feed the chickens and collect what few eggs they still bother to lay. In the afternoon, when my back starts to remind me of my age, I sit in the chair Lillian used to read in, and I go through the same newspaper I picked up in town last week. I read it slowly, sometimes the same article twice, because there's no hurry anymore. Time moves differently out here. It doesn't rush. It settles like dust. I keep a notebook, too. Started it years ago when I still thought I could predict the weather by watching the animals, by noting the thickness of the moss on the north side of the oaks, by measuring the weight of the morning fog. I write down temperatures, wind direction, when the first frost comes, when the creek runs high. Lillian used to tease me about it, said I was trying to control the seasons. Maybe I just needed to believe there was an order to things, a rhythm I could learn and follow. Now I keep writing in it mostly out of habit. The entries are shorter these days. Sometimes just a date and a temperature, sometimes nothing at all. When evening comes, the silence grows heavier. It's not an empty silence. There's the chorus of crickets starting up in the tall grass, the groan of old wood settling as the house cools, the far-off yip and howl of coyotes calling to each other across the ridge. I've learned to recognize these sounds, to expect them, to find a strange kind of peace in them. They're honest sounds, predictable. They don't lie. They don't leave. I eat dinner alone, usually something simple. Beans, rice, sometimes a piece of meat if I've made the trip into town. I wash the dish in the sink, dry it, put it back in the cabinet. Then I sit on the porch if the weather's decent, or in the chair by the wood stove if it's not, and I listen. The darkness comes on slow in summer, fast in winter, but it always comes. And with it, that particular quiet that belongs to places where people are scarce and the land is old. I suppose most folks would call this loneliness. My son did the last time he visited. He stood in the kitchen, looking around at the dust on the shelves and the single plate drying by the sink. And he said, "Dad, this isn't living." But he's wrong. This is exactly living. This is what's left when everything else gets stripped away. No pretending. No small talk. No filling the air with words just to avoid the truth of things. Out here, the silence is a companion. It sits with me in the evenings. It walks with me when I check the barn before bed. It's there when I wake in the middle of the night and stare at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. I've made peace with it. Or I thought I had. Because something changed. I don't know exactly when it started. Maybe it had always been there and I just hadn't noticed. But at some point, the silence stopped being empty. It started to feel occupied, like something had moved into the space between the sounds. Something that listened when I moved, that waited when I slept, that watched from the edges of the property, where the trees grow thick and the shadows never quite lift, even in the middle of the day. At first I told myself it was nothing. Age playing tricks. The mind-inventing company where there is none. But the feeling persisted, grew. I'd be splitting wood in the afternoon and I'd feel the weight of attention on my back, as certain as sunlight, and I'd turn and see nothing but the swaying branches and the flicker of light through the leaves. I'd lock the doors at night and lie awake listening, and beneath the familiar sounds there would be something else, something that didn't belong. I don't scare easy. I've lived through winters that killed livestock, through droughts that cracked the earth open, through the grief of burying the only woman I ever loved. Fear is just another kind of weather. You learn to endure it. But this was different. This wasn't fear of something I could name. It was the recognition that the world I thought I understood had quietly opened a door I didn't know existed, and something had stepped through. The silence, I realized, had begun to listen back. It started on a night when there was no moon. I remember that specifically because I'd gone out to the barn after midnight to check on a noise. Sleep doesn't come easy anymore, and every sound registers differently in the dark. This one was wrong somehow. Not the usual creak of wood or rustle of some small animal in the brush. It was heavier, deliberate. I took the flashlight from beside the bed and walked out into the cold. The air had that particular bite that comes in early autumn, when summer finally admits defeat, and the darkness smells like decay and wet earth. The beam of light cut through the black, catching the pale bark of the birches at the edge of the clearing, and I swept it slowly across the yard, looking for whatever had woken me. The barn door was slightly ajar. I always close it, always. But I told myself maybe I'd forgotten, maybe the latch hadn't caught properly. Age makes you doubt your own habits. I pulled the door wider and stepped inside, and that's when the smell hit me. Something rank and wild, like wet fur and iron and rotting wood all mixed together. The chickens were quiet, too quiet, and I could feel their fear even in the darkness. Animals know things we don't. They can sense wrongness before it has a name. I checked the coop, counted the birds, found them all there but agitated, their feathers puffed, their eyes wide and unblinking in the beam of my light. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been disturbed, not really. But something had been there. I could feel the residue of it, the way you can feel the presence of someone who's just left a room. When I stepped back outside, I nearly lost my footing. The ground was soft from yesterday's rain, and there in the mud, clear as anything I'd ever seen, were tracks. I've lived in these woods long enough to know every animal that passes through. Deer, raccoon, possum, coyote, even the occasional bobcat. These tracks were none of those things. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot print, 5 toes, splayed wide, with what looked like the impression of a heel sunk deep into the earth. The stride was long, purposeful, leading from the tree line to the barn and then back again, disappearing into the shadows beyond the fence. I stood there in my pajamas and jacket, flashlight in hand, staring at those prints and feeling something cold settle into my chest. Not fear exactly, recognition. The kind that comes when you realize the world is larger and stranger than you'd been willing to admit. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the chair by the window with the shotgun across my lap, watching the tree line, waiting for movement that never came. When the sun finally rose, pale and thin through the morning fog, I went back outside to look at the tracks again. They were still there, real, undeniable. I knelt beside them, placed my hand next to one of the prints for scale. My whole hand fit inside a single toe impression. I told myself it must have been a bear. Had to be. But there haven't been bears on this property in over 15 years. Not since the logging company cleared out the old growth to the west and the animals moved on. Still, I needed it to be a bear. I needed there to be an explanation that fit inside the boundaries of what I knew. The next morning I found the chicken coop in disarray. One of the doors had been torn completely off its hinges. The wood splintered like it had been ripped apart by something with terrible strength. But again, no birds were missing. They were all there, huddled in the corner, refusing to leave even when I scattered feed. The floor was covered in mud, the same strange tracks pressed into the straw, and that smell was back. Stronger this time. It clung to everything, thick and wrong, and no amount of fresh air seemed to clear it. I spent that day cleaning, repairing the door, trying to convince myself this was normal. Just an animal, just nature doing what nature does. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something else, something intentional. Like whatever had come wasn't hungry. It was curious. Or worse, it was trying to tell me something. That night I barely closed my eyes. I lay in bed, fully clothed, the shotgun leaning against the nightstand, and I listened. The wind moved through the trees the way it always did, but there was something different about it. A rhythm, a cadence. It would blow in long, steady gusts, then pause, then blow again. Like breathing. Heavy, deliberate breathing. I sat up, my heart pounding harder than it had in years, and I strained to hear beyond the wind. And then I heard it. My name, dragged out, distorted, barely a whisper but unmistakably human in shape. Harold. It came from somewhere outside, somewhere close to the house, and it made every hair on my body stand on end. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the window, pressed my face to the glass, but all I could see was my own reflection and the darkness beyond. The voice didn't come again, just the wind moving through the night, carrying with it the smell of pine and cold earth and something I couldn't name. I thought about Lillian then, about the day we buried her, about the way the sound of the dirt hitting the coffin seemed to go on forever, each shovel full landing with a hollow thud that echoed in my chest. I remembered standing there, alone even though I was surrounded by people, and feeling like I was being lowered into the ground with her, like I was the one being buried. And I felt that same thing now, that same weight, the sense that something was ending or beginning, and I had no say in it, no control. The next few days passed in a haze of exhaustion and vigilance. I checked the property constantly, walked the fence line until my knees ached, kept the shotgun within arm's reach. The tracks appeared and disappeared, sometimes fresh, sometimes faded, always in the same places, near the barn, by the tree line, once impossibly right outside my bedroom window, pressed into the flower bed Lillian had planted years ago and that I'd somehow kept alive. I stopped going into town, stopped answering the phone when my son called. I couldn't explain what was happening, not in a way that would make sense, and I knew what they'd say, that I was losing it, that the isolation had finally gotten to me. That grief does strange things to the mind. But I wasn't imagining this. I knew that with the same certainty I knew my own name. Something was out there, something that moved through the dark, that watched and waited, that knew I was here. And for reasons I couldn't begin to understand, it had decided that I mattered, that I was worth visiting, worth speaking to. The question I couldn't answer, the question that kept me awake through those long, cold nights, was simple and terrible. What did it want from me? After a week of sleepless nights and mounting dread, I remembered the old trail camera my son had left behind years ago, back when he still came up to hunt deer in the fall. It was in a box in the attic, buried under moth-eaten blankets and photo albums I couldn't bring myself to look through. I climbed up there one afternoon, my joints protesting every rung of the ladder, and dug through the accumulated debris of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The camera was still there, dusty but intact, along with a memory card and a tangle of straps and mounting brackets. I brought it down, spent the better part of an hour reading the faded instructions and replacing the batteries. My hands shook as I worked, though whether from age or anticipation I couldn't say. I told myself this was practical, logical. If something was coming onto my property, I had a right to know what it was. I had a right to proof. I mounted the camera on the porch, angling it toward the tree line where the tracks always seemed to originate. The motion sensor, according to the manual, would trigger automatically, recording 30 seconds of footage each time something passed in front of it. I tested it once, walking across the yard, and watched the little red light blink on. Good enough. I left it there as the sun began its slow descent behind the ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded me of bruises. That night, I sat inside with every light in the house on tune, which was something I never did. The waste of electricity would have horrified Lillian, but I needed the brightness, needed to push back against the darkness that seemed to press against the windows, like something tangible, something with weight and intent. I drank coffee until my hands trembled, watched the clock and waited. Around midnight, I heard it. Not the voice this time, but footsteps. Heavy, measured, crunching through the dry leaves and fallen twigs. They moved slowly, deliberately, with none of the quick, skittish energy of a deer or the loping rhythm of a coyote. These were the footsteps of something large, something bipedal, something that had no fear of being heard. I stood frozen in the center of the room, the coffee mug still in my hand, listening as the steps came closer. They reached the edge of the porch, and I could hear the wood creak under the weight. 1 step, 2, 3, and then they stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was expectant, waiting. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might simply give up. Thought this might be how it ended. Alone in this house with my hand clutched around a mug and something unknowable standing just beyond the door. Then came the sound of wood splintering. Not the door, thank God, but something else. Something farther away, the barn. I heard the unmistakable shriek of metal twisting, hinges giving way, and then footsteps again, this time moving away back toward the trees, fading into the night until there was nothing but the wind and my own ragged breathing. I didn't go outside, not then. I waited until dawn, until the world was painted in shades of gray and the shadows had retreated to their proper places. When I finally stepped onto the porch, the camera was still there, blinking. The motion sensor had been triggered multiple times. My hands shook so badly I could barely remove the memory card. I went inside, plugged it into the old laptop my daughter had given me 2 Christmases ago, the one I barely knew how to use. It took me 20 minutes to figure out how to access the files, to click through the folders and find the video recordings. There were 4 of them, each time-stamped in the early hours of the morning. I clicked on the first one. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the porch and the yard beyond, lit faintly by the camera's infrared. Then, at the edge of the frame, something moved. It emerged from the tree line slowly, and even on the small, grainy screen I could see it was massive. Broad shoulders, long arms, a gait that was almost human but not quite. It moved with a kind of deliberate slowness, like it had all the time in the world, like it knew it owned the night and everything in it. The figure crossed the yard, and I realized with a sick feeling that it was heading straight for the porch, straight for the camera. It stopped maybe 10 feet away, and for the first time I could see it clearly, or as clearly as the infrared would allow. Tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, covered in what looked like dark fur or hair, matted and wet-looking. The proportions were wrong somehow. The arms too long, the shoulders too wide, the head too large and strangely shaped. It stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds, and then it did something that made my blood turn to ice. It lifted its head and looked directly at the camera. Directly at me. The eyes... God, the eyes! They reflected the infrared light, glowing a pale amber, bright and intelligent and utterly inhuman. They held the camera's gaze with what I can only describe as awareness. It knew it was being watched. It knew I was there on the other side of that lens, and it didn't care. Or worse, it wanted me to know, wanted me to see. Then, as calmly as it had arrived, it turned and walked back toward the trees, disappearing into the darkness like it had never been there at all. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the laptop screen, replaying the footage over and over. Each time I saw something new, the way it moved, fluid and powerful, the way it seemed to pause and listen before each step. The intelligence in those eyes. This wasn't some dumb animal. This was something else entirely, something that thought, that planned, that understood. I called the sheriff's office that afternoon, drove into town with the laptop under my arm, feeling both ridiculous and terrified. The sheriff, a man named Harlan who'd known me for 30 years, watched the footage with a skeptical expression that never wavered. When it was done, he leaned back in his chair and smiled, not unkindly, but not believingly either. Could be someone playing a prank, he said. Could be a guy in a costume. Hell, Harold. Could be you've been alone out there too long and your eyes are playing tricks. He suggested I might want to talk to someone, maybe see a doctor, maybe consider my son's offer to move closer to town. He didn't say I was crazy, but he didn't have to. I could see it in his face, in the way he handed the laptop back to me like it was something fragile, something that might break. I called my kids that evening, showed them the footage over a video call, their faces small and distant on the screen. My oldest son sighed, rubbed his eyes and said, "Dad, you need people around you. You need company, not cameras." My daughter was kinder but no less convinced. "Maybe it's stressing, Dad," she said. "Maybe the isolation is harder than you think." I stopped trying to convince anyone after that. What was the point? I'd seen it with my own eyes, captured it on video, and still no one believed. They'd rather think I was losing my mind than accept that something impossible was walking through those woods. Maybe that's easier. Maybe the world only makes sense if we agree to ignore the parts that don't fit. But I kept the camera running, and it kept coming back. Every few nights, there it would be on the footage, sometimes just passing through, sometimes stopping to look at the house, at the barn, at the camera itself. Once I caught it standing at the edge of the porch for nearly 5 minutes, swaying slightly, like it was listening to something I couldn't hear. The footage showed its chest rising and falling, breathing, alive. I began to feel hunted, not in the way prey feels hunted, with panic and the urge to run, but in a quieter, more insidious way, like I was being studied, observed, like I was part of some experiment I didn't understand and couldn't escape. Every evening, as the light faded and the shadows grew long, I felt the weight of its attention settling over the property like a fog. I stopped sleeping entirely. I'd sit up all night, the shotgun across my lap, the laptop open on the table showing the live feed from the camera, watching, waiting, knowing it would come, and knowing there was nothing I could do to stop it, because whatever it wasn't afraid of me. It wasn't afraid of anything. And increasingly, I began to wonder if it even saw me as separate from the landscape, from the trees and the barn and the fences. Maybe, to it, I was just another feature of this place, another thing to be examined and understood. Or maybe it saw me exactly for what I was, a tired old man alone in the woods, desperate for someone, something to acknowledge that he still existed. Maybe that's what it had been doing all along. The visits became routine, not frequent enough to predict, but regular enough that I began to orient my life around them. Every 2 or 3 nights, the camera would capture movement. Every few days, I'd find fresh tracks in the mud near the barn or pressed into the soft earth around the well. The chickens stopped laying entirely, huddled together in the corner of their coop, and I couldn't blame them. I felt the same way, like some primal part of my brain was screaming to make myself small, to hide, to become invisible. But there was nowhere to hide. Not really. The house that had once felt like sanctuary now felt like a cage, and the woods beyond, the same woods I'd walked for decades without fear, had transformed into something else entirely. A boundary, a threshold between the world I knew and something vast and incomprehensible that had decided to cross over. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie in bed, fully dressed, boots still on, listening to every sound. The house had always been noisy, old wood settling, pipes groaning, the wind finding its way through gaps in the siding. But now every creak was a footstep. Every gust was breathing. My mind couldn't rest, couldn't let go, couldn't stop trying to distinguish between the familiar and the foreign. 3 nights after I showed the video to the sheriff, it happened again. I was sitting at the kitchen table, going through the latest footage, when I heard the sound, branches breaking, not the small snap of a twig underfoot, but the deep crack of something thick being torn apart. The sound came from the north side of the property, where the pines grow dense and the undergrowth is tangled with blackberry vines and fallen logs. I went to the window, pressed my forehead against the cold glass, and tried to see into the darkness. The moon was a thin sliver, barely providing any light, and the shadows seemed to move and shift like living things. Then I heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving through the trees with a weight that shook the ground. I could feel it through the floorboards, a rhythmic tremor that matched the beating of my heart. The steps came closer. I backed away from the window, grabbed the shotgun and stood in the center of the kitchen, the barrel pointed at the door. My hands were steady, surprisingly so, but my breathing came in short, shallow gasps. The steps reached the yard, crossed it, came up onto the porch. The wood groaned under the weight. I heard something drag across the wall outside, something rough and heavy, like a hand running along the siding. And then came the voice, not a whisper this time, not something carried on the wind that I could pretend was my imagination. This was clear, distinct, impossible. It came from just outside the kitchen window, deep and guttural, like something speaking through a throat that had never learned human language, but was trying desperately to mimic it. Harold. My name, pulled from the darkness and spoken with such precision that I felt my knees go weak. I wanted to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there with that gun in my hands, facing a door that suddenly seemed far too thin, far too fragile to keep anything out. But I couldn't move, couldn't look away from that door, from the space where I knew something stood, waiting, listening for my response. I didn't answer. Couldn't. My throat had closed completely, and even if I'd wanted to speak, I'm not sure what I would have said. What do you say to something that shouldn't exist? What words make sense in the face of the impossible? The voice came again, closer now, pressed against the door like lips against wood. Harold, there was something wrong with the sound. It wasn't just the depth of it, or the way it seemed to vibrate through my chest. It was the inflection, the way it rose slightly at the end, questioning, curious, like it was testing the name, rolling it around in its mouth, trying to understand what it meant. And beneath that, underneath the careful pronunciation, I could hear something else, an echo, like my own voice, distorted and stretched, played back to me through a recording that had been left out in the rain and sun until it warped and degraded into something unrecognizable. The footsteps moved away. I heard them descend from the porch, cross the yard, fade into the trees. I stood there until dawn, the gun never leaving my hands, my body locked in place by a fear so profound it felt almost religious. When the first grey light finally crept through the windows, I collapsed into a chair and wept, not from relief, but from the terrible certainty that this would happen again, that it would keep happening, that whatever boundary had been crossed, there was no going back. I stopped eating regularly. Food tasted like ash, and the act of preparing it, of going through the motions of normalcy, felt absurd. I'd open the refrigerator and stare at its contents without comprehension, as if I'd forgotten what hunger was or why it mattered. I lost weight. My clothes hung loose on my frame, and when I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized the gaunt, hollow-eyed man staring back at me. The days blurred together. I checked the cameras obsessively, reviewing footage from the previous night, looking for patterns, for meaning, for some clue that would help me understand what was happening. The creature appeared in maybe half the recordings, sometimes just a shadow moving at the edge of the frame, sometimes standing in full view, its amber eyes reflecting the infrared light like coins at the bottom of a well. I began to notice details I'd missed before, the way it would tilt its head when it stood still, as if listening to something beyond my range of hearing. The way its hands, when visible, had fingers too long and joints that bent at angles that made my stomach turn. The way it never seemed to blink, those eyes always open, always watching. And then one morning I found the mark. I'd gone to the kitchen to make coffee, moving through the routine without thinking, and I noticed the window, the one that faces the backyard, the one where I'd heard the voice. The glass was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures radiating from a central point, but it was what had caused the crack that stopped my heart. A handprint, pressed into the glass with enough force to break it, but not shatter it completely. The print was enormous, easily 3 times the size of my own hand. 5 fingers, each ending in what looked like a blunt claw, and smeared across the palm and fingers was something dark. I touched it carefully, and it flaked off onto my fingertips, dirt, mud, and something else, something that smelled metallic and organic and wrong. I stood there for a long time, staring at that handprint, and something inside me finally broke. Not my mind exactly, but the last fragile thread of denial I'd been clinging to. This was real, all of it. The tracks, the sounds, the voice, the figure on the camera, real, undeniable, and no one, not one single person in my entire life, would ever believe me. That night, I didn't bother with the lights. I sat in darkness, in the chair by the window, and I waited. The gun was across my lap, loaded but somehow irrelevant. What good would it do? What could I possibly defend against? If this thing wanted to come in, to take me, to do whatever it was it had been working toward, there was nothing I could do to stop it. But it didn't come that night, or the next. The camera showed nothing. The woods were silent except for the usual sounds, the ones I'd lived with for decades. It was as if it had made its point, left its message in cracked glass and dried earth, and was now content to wait and see what I would do with that information. I thought about leaving, packing what I could fit in the truck and driving away, going to my son's house in Portland, accepting the help I'd been too proud to ask for. But every time I started to gather my things, I'd stop. Where would I go? What would I say? And more importantly, what made me think it wouldn't follow? That handprint on the window wasn't a threat. It was a claim, a mark of ownership. This thing, whatever it was, had chosen me, had singled me out for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. And deep down, in a place I didn't want to examine too closely, I realized something that horrified me. Part of me didn't want to leave. Part of me needed to see this through, to understand what it wanted, even if that understanding destroyed me, because for the first time since Lillian died, I felt seen, acknowledged, like I mattered to something, even if that something was a nightmare made flesh. The isolation I'd chosen, the solitude I'd wrapped around myself like armor, had been stripped away. I was no longer alone, and God help me, there was a terrible comfort in that. The storm came 3 days later, rolling in from the west with a fury I hadn't seen in years. The sky turned the color of a bruise in the early afternoon, and by evening, the wind was tearing at the trees with a violence that made the whole house shudder. Rain came in sheets, hammering against the roof and windows, and the temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath inside the kitchen. I'd spent the day preparing as best I could, brought in extra wood for the stove, filled every pot and bucket with water in case the well pump lost power, checked the generator even though I knew its age made it unreliable. The weather reports on the radio had called for a severe system, possible flooding in the low areas, power outages likely, standard enough warnings for this time of year. But there was something about this storm that felt different, personal, almost like it had been sent specifically for this place, for this night. The power went out around 8. The lights flickered twice, then died, plunging the house into darkness broken only by the weak glow of the oil lamp I'd set on the kitchen table. The generator, as I'd feared, refused to start. I pulled the cord a dozen times, my hands numb from the cold and rain, but it just coughed and sputtered and went silent. So I retreated inside, lit 2 more lamps, and tried to tell myself this was just weather, just the natural world doing what it does. But I knew better. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the air seemed charged with more than just electricity, in the way the wind didn't just blow but seemed to circle the house, testing it, probing for weaknesses. Something was coming. Something had been building toward this moment. And now, in the chaos of the storm, it would finally reveal itself completely. I sat in the living room, the shotgun on my lap, listening to the house groan and creak around me. The rain was so loud it sounded like static, white noise that filled every space and made it impossible to distinguish individual sounds. Lightning flashed, throwing stark shadows across the walls, and thunder followed so close it rattled the windows in their frames. The storm was directly overhead now, and I was trapped inside it, inside this fragile structure of wood and glass, with nothing between me and whatever was out there except old walls and blind hope. That's when I heard it. Underneath the roar of wind and rain, a voice, my name, carried on the storm like a prayer or a curse, stretched and distorted but unmistakable. Harold. It came from outside the front door, close, so close I could almost feel the breath behind the word, the shape of the mouth forming each syllable. I stood, raising the gun, my hands shaking, not from fear but from exhaustion, from weeks of sleepless nights and mounting dread finally coalescing into this single moment. The door shook. Not from the wind, from something pressing against it, testing the lock, the hinges, the strength of the wood. The frame groaned, and I heard the old metal of the latch begin to protest. I backed away, the gun aimed at the center of the door, my finger on the trigger, and I waited for it to burst inward, for the thing I'd been watching on camera to finally step into the light and show itself fully. But it didn't break through. Instead, the pressure released, and I heard footsteps moving away around the side of the house, heavy and purposeful even through the mud and rain. They were heading toward the barn. I don't know what made me follow. Common sense would have said to stay inside, to lock the door and wait for morning, to let whatever was happening happen without me as a witness. But I couldn't. After weeks of being hunted, observed, studied, something in me snapped. I needed to confront this, needed to face it, even if facing it meant my death, because this half-life of terror and uncertainty had become worse than any ending could be. I grabbed a flashlight, checked that the shotgun was loaded, and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit me like a physical force, soaking through my jacket in seconds, plastering my hair to my skull. The wind tore at me, trying to push me back toward the house, but I pressed forward, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness and rain, illuminating nothing but water and mud and the vague shapes of familiar things made alien by the storm. I reached the barn and found the door open. Not just open, but torn from its track. The heavy sliding door that had taken me and Lillian's brother a full day to install now lying in the mud, twisted and bent. I stepped inside, out of the worst of the rain, and swept the flashlight across the interior. Everything looked normal at first. The tools hanging on their hooks, the old tractor in the corner, the stacks of hay bales covered in tarps. But then the light caught something on the far wall, and my legs nearly gave out beneath me. My name, written in letters 3 feet tall, uneven and dripping, covering almost the entire back wall of the barn. The substance looked dark in the flashlight beam. Viscous creaks, and when I got closer, the smell hit me. Blood. Animal blood. From the iron-sharp scent of it, mixed with something else, something that reminded me of the smell that had clung to the chicken coop after the first visit. I stood there, staring at those letters, at my name rendered in something primitive and deliberate, and I felt my mind trying to fracture, to split apart and scatter so it wouldn't have to process what this meant. This wasn't random. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. This was intentional, purposeful, a message or a claim or something I didn't have the language to understand. The flashlight flickered. The batteries were dying. And I realized with a sick lurch of panic that I was standing in a dark barn in the middle of a storm, with my name written in blood on the wall, and something that had put it there still out there in the night. I turned to leave, to run back to the house and lock every door and window and pray for dawn. But I only made it 2 steps before the world tilted. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was fear finally overwhelming my system. Maybe it was the simple fact that my 73-year-old body had been pushed past its limits. Whatever the cause, my vision went grey at the edges. My knees buckled and I felt myself falling. The ground came up fast, cold and wet, and the last thing I saw before darkness took me was the beam of the flashlight, lying sideways in the mud, illuminating nothing but rain. When I woke, it was to voices and hands pulling at me, lifting me. The sky was pale grey, the storm passed, and I was no longer in the barn but lying in the mud outside it, soaked and shivering. I recognized my son's voice, urgent and frightened, calling my name. I recognized the sheriff's gruff tone, talking into a radio, calling for an ambulance. I tried to speak, to tell them about the barn, about what I'd seen written on the wall, but my throat was raw and my words came out as croaks. They took me inside, wrapped me in blankets, and I watched through the window as the sheriff and one of his deputies walked to the barn. I waited for them to come back, to confirm what I'd seen, to finally validate the nightmare I'd been living. But when they returned, their faces showed only concern. Concern for me, not for what they'd found. The barn was fine, the sheriff said. Door was on its track. A little loose maybe, but intact. No damage, no blood, no writing. Nothing but the usual clutter of an old farm building. He suggested gently that maybe I'd fallen and hit my head, that maybe the storm and the dark had played tricks on my eyes. My son stood beside him, his face grey with worry, and I could see what he was thinking. What they were all thinking. That I'd finally lost it. That the isolation and the grief and the weight of years had broken something fundamental in my mind. That the crazy old man talking about monsters in the woods had wandered out into a storm and collapsed in the mud, hallucinating things that were never there. I tried to explain, tried to tell them about the cameras, the footage, the handprint on the window. But when they checked, the cameras were gone, not just turned off or damaged, but completely removed. The mounting brackets torn from the wood, no trace that they'd ever been there. The cracked window was whole. The tracks I'd photographed with my phone had vanished from the saved images, leaving only darkness and error messages. Everything, every piece of evidence, every proof that I wasn't insane, had been erased, scrubbed clean, as if the past weeks had never happened, as if I'd dreamed it all while slowly losing my grip on reality. The ambulance came. They loaded me onto a stretcher despite my protests, checked my vitals, shined lights in my eyes. My son rode with me, holding my hand, and I could see the tears on his face, the guilt and grief and helplessness. He thought he was losing me the same way we'd lost Lillian. Slowly, inevitably, to something medical and sad and beyond anyone's control. No one believed me. How could they? There was nothing to believe, just the confused ravings of an old man who'd lived alone too long, who'd let his mind fill the silence with monsters, because the alternative, the simple fact of being forgotten and irrelevant and alone, was somehow worse. And maybe they were right. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe the mind, when it's desperate enough, can create anything. Even evidence. Even certainty. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what had written my name on that wall, even if the writing had vanished like morning frost. And deep in my chest, where fear lives, I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't over, that whatever had chosen me, whatever had marked me, wasn't done yet, that it would follow me wherever they took me next. I write these words from a room that is not my own, in a building that smells of disinfectant and despair, in a place where the windows have bars and the doors locked from the outside. They call it a treatment facility, but the name doesn't change what it is. A place for people who can no longer be trusted with their own minds, who have drifted too far from the agreed-upon reality, and need to be gently guided back, or at least kept from harming themselves in their confusion. The room is small. White walls, a narrow bed with sheets that feel industrial and cold, a single chair by the window where I sit most days, looking out at a courtyard I'm not allowed to enter without supervision. There are other patients here, though we don't call each other that. We're guests, residents, participants in our own recovery. We shuffle through hallways in slippers and loose clothing, medicated into a kind of numb compliance, and we pretend that this is temporary, that we'll all go home soon, back to the lives we had before whatever broke inside us finally gave way. My children visit once a week. They bring magazines I don't read and food from restaurants I don't recognize, and they sit across from me with careful expressions, asking how I'm feeling, if I'm sleeping better, if the doctors are helping. I tell them what they want to hear, that yes, I'm feeling clearer, that the medication is working, that I understand now that what I experienced was a kind of breakdown, brought on by isolation and grief, and the simple weight of being old and alone. They smile when I say these things, relieved, and I can see the hope in their eyes that maybe their father is coming back, that maybe the stranger who talked about monsters and showed them impossible videos is fading away, replaced by the man they remember. But I'm lying, to them, to the doctors, to everyone who asks, because nothing has changed. I know what I saw. I know what happened in those weeks on the farm, in the darkness beyond the tree line, in the moments when something vast and unknowable decided I was worth its attention. The medication dulls the edges of it, makes the memories feel distant and dreamlike, but it doesn't erase them. Nothing could erase them, and the truth is it followed me here, not in the way it did before. There are no footsteps in these sterile hallways, no tracks in the carefully maintained flower beds of the courtyard, but it's here nonetheless. I feel it in the way the wind sounds when it moves through the bars on my window, carrying with it an echo that shouldn't exist in a place this controlled, this civilized. I hear it in the quiet hours after lights out, when the building settles and the other patients are lost to their own troubled sleep. A breathing, slow and steady and patient, waiting. Sometimes in the deepest part of the night I hear my name, not shouted or whispered, but spoken with that same careful pronunciation, that same guttural quality, like something is still learning the shape of the word, still testing how it feels in a throat, not designed for human speech. The nurses don't hear it. The other patients don't react. It's meant only for me, a reminder, a thread connecting me to something that refuses to let go. I've stopped trying to convince anyone. What would be the point? I showed them evidence and they dismissed it. I told them the truth and they medicated it away. The world, I've learned, only has room for a certain kind of reality. Anything that falls outside those boundaries, anything that doesn't fit neatly into the categories we've agreed upon, must be either explained away or labeled as madness. There's no middle ground. No space for the possibility that the universe is stranger and more terrible than we're willing to admit. The doctors tell me I'm suffering from what they call late-onset psychosis, exacerbated by social isolation and complicated grief. They've given me a diagnosis that fits in their files, a treatment plan that follows established protocols, and a prognosis that suggests with time and medication and therapy, I might be able to return to some semblance of normal life. They're kind, these doctors. They genuinely want to help, but they're trying to fix something that isn't broken, or rather, they're trying to fix me when what's broken is the world's willingness to see. I think often about what it means to know something that no one else believes, to carry a truth so heavy and so impossible that it separates you from every other person you'll ever meet. It's a unique kind of loneliness, worse in some ways than the isolation I felt on the farm, because at least there, I was alone by choice, by circumstance. Here I'm alone because I've seen something I wasn't supposed to see, and that seeing has marked me, set me apart, made me fundamentally incompatible with the comfortable consensus of reality that everyone else inhabits. The price of truth, I've discovered, is exile. Not physical exile, though this place certainly qualifies, but a deeper kind. An exile from certainty, from the shared stories we tell ourselves about how the world works, from the collective agreement that keeps society functioning. I've been cast out of that agreement, not by choice but by experience, and there's no way back. Even if I could forget what I saw, even if the medication could truly erase it, the knowledge would remain. The knowing changes you. It rewrites something fundamental in your understanding of what's possible. And once that rewriting happens, you can never quite fit back into the old patterns. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better to have never seen it at all, to have lived out my remaining years on that farm in peaceful ignorance, alone but unburdened by impossible knowledge. But that choice was never really mine. It chose me. For whatever reason, in whatever way such things are decided, I was selected, marked, and now I carry that mark whether I want to or not. The other patients here, the ones who pace the halls and mutter to themselves, the ones who see things in corners and hear voices in the walls, I look at them differently now. I used to think before all this that madness was a kind of failure, a breaking down of the mind's ability to process reality correctly. But now I wonder if maybe some of them, maybe even most of them, aren't mad at all. Maybe they're just people who saw something true and terrible, something that didn't fit into the acceptable narrative, and the world's only response was to lock them away and call it treatment. Maybe we're all exiles from the same place, the place where the world shows its real face, the one behind the mask of normalcy and order, the face that's neither kind nor cruel, neither good nor evil, but simply vast and unknowable and utterly indifferent to human categories of understanding. I don't know what it wanted from me. I've spent countless hours in this room, staring out at the courtyard, trying to understand the purpose behind those visits, those signs, that careful spelling of my name in blood on a wall that no one else could see. Maybe there was no purpose. Maybe it was simple curiosity. Maybe to something like that, I'm no different than the deer I used to watch from my porch, or the birds that nested in the eaves, or the coyotes calling across the ridge. Just another creature, worthy of observation but not of explanation. Or maybe the purpose was exactly this, to show me that the world is deeper and stranger than I'd been willing to believe, to strip away the comfortable illusions I'd built around myself, the ones that said I understood how things worked, that said the universe played by rules I could comprehend. Maybe the gift, if you can call it that, was simply the knowledge that there's more, that beneath the surface of the mundane, the daily, the explicable, there's an ocean of mystery so deep we'll never touch the bottom. But knowledge like that comes with a cost. The cost is community. The cost is belief. The cost is the simple human comfort of being understood, of having your experience validated, of knowing that when you speak, others hear you. I've lost all of that. In exchange, I've gained a certainty that no one can take from me, no matter how many pills they give me or how many doctors shake their heads in sympathetic concern. I've gained the certainty that I was seen, that for a brief moment in the vast indifference of the universe, something noticed I existed. Something spoke my name, and whether that something was a creature of flesh and bone, a manifestation of my own fractured psyche, or something else entirely, Something that exists in the spaces between those categories doesn't really matter. What matters is that it happened. That the boundary I thought existed between the known and unknown, between the safe world of farms and fences and the wild world of forest and shadow, was never really there at all. We live our lives pretending we're separate from that wildness, that we've tamed it, contained it, pushed it back to the edges where it can't touch us. But it's all pretense, all comfortable fiction. The wild is always there, always watching, always waiting, and sometimes, for reasons that may have no reason, it reaches across that imaginary boundary and reminds us of what we really are. Not masters of the world, not separate from nature, just small, fragile things, barely holding back the dark with our artificial lights and locked doors and carefully maintained illusions. The wind is picking up outside. I can hear it moving through the bars of my window, and underneath the ordinary sound of air moving past metal, I hear something else. Something familiar. A breath, a word. My name, pulled from the approaching night and delivered to this small white room where I sit, writing these words, knowing that no one will believe them. But I write them anyway. Not for belief, not for validation, but for the simple act of recording what happened, of putting into words the thing that language was never quite designed to hold, so that somewhere, somehow, there's a record, a testimony, a small piece of evidence that might survive even if I don't. The truth doesn't set you free. That's the lie we tell ourselves, the comforting story about how knowledge is power and understanding brings liberation. The truth, the real truth, the kind that tears apart your carefully constructed reality and shows you the vastness underneath. That truth is a prison. It isolates you. It separates you from everyone and everything you thought you knew. It takes your old life and burns it to ash, and offers nothing in return except the cold comfort of certainty. But even knowing that, even understanding the cost, I wouldn't change it. Because for all the loneliness, for all the fear and confusion and exile, I know something now that most people never will. I know that the abyss is real, that it exists beyond the tree line and the comfort of our electric lights, that it watches us the way we watch ants building their hills or fish swimming in streams, with a kind of alien curiosity that has nothing to do with love or hate or any emotion we'd recognize. And I know something else, too. Something I've only just begun to understand in these quiet, medicated hours. The abyss, when it looks back at you, when it reaches across the boundary and speaks, it does you the courtesy of knowing your name. It sees you, specifically, individually you. And in a world where most of us live our entire lives feeling invisible, unnoticed, forgotten by the universe and everyone in it, there's a strange and terrible comfort in being seen, even if what sees you is darkness itself.